table saw. We're going to be using the table saw for a lot of different tasks in theater. The primary task that we'll be using is for ripping long sheets of pine into narrower strips. So that's the process called ripping. We also use it for taking down larger sheets of plywood, masonite, and luan for other set construction projects, platforms, flats, that sort of thing. It's a very useful, versatile tool. It can do a whole lot more than that with special jigs. It can do mortise and tenons, it can do coves, it can even cut circles, but we don't normally do that in the theater. We're not going to get into those fancy tasks today. The table saw is one of the most dangerous tools in the shop. There's an argument between whether the table saw is the most dangerous or whether the bandsaw is the most dangerous. It's about which can do the most kind of harm to you. And this table saw can really tear up your fingers if your fingers come up into contact with the blade. And it can take off fingers if it comes into contact with the blade. It's going to do it in a real brutal way. This saw has some features built into it. It's a saw stop table saw. That means it's got a brain in it, and it's got a blade that knows if your finger touches the blade, and it senses that electrical connection, and it stops it before it chews up your finger, which is a good thing.
Safety operating procedures are posted on the tool or next to the tool. These procedures represent the most important safety operations and considerations while using this tool or equipment, but are not intended to be comprehensive coverage of every possible use. For more complete safety instructions, please refer to the tool and equipment user manuals. Do not use this machine unless you have been instructed in its safe use and operations and you are complying with college and departmental shop safety guidelines and procedures. Safety glasses are required and must be worn at all times. All saws require safety glasses as minimum eye protection. Hearing protection is recommended. This tool does generate loud and high-pitched noise during operation. If you are using this saw repeatedly, you should wear ear protection. Long or loose hair, neckties, and loose or baggy clothing must be contained. Tie back or tie up hair, roll up long sleeves, tuck in your shirt. A dust mask or respirator may be required for some operations, especially when cutting materials that create a lot of fine dust, such as homasote or Upsom board, masonite, or MDF materials. Rings, watches, and loose jewelry should not be worn. Gloves should not be worn while operating this tool. If they were to get caught in the blade, it could lead to serious injury. Pre-operational safety checks. Locate and ensure you are familiar with all machine operations and controls. Controls and adjustments may vary from tool to tool, particularly among different manufacturers of the same type of tool. First of all, there's an on-off button here. There's two on-off buttons. One is a power off for the entire machine. Your machine will normally go through about a 10 or 15 second cycle warm-up. When you turn it on the first time, it's already been on for a few minutes, so it's not going to go through that. You should end up with a solid green light and the red light not lit, and that means you are ready to go. The start-stop button is here. You just pull out to start, and you push to stop. The nice thing about the position of this big paddle is that you can use your knee to stop it after you've pushed the lumber through. To the right of that is the blade height adjustment. It has a lock knob where you can lock it down and it won't turn. When we want to adjust the blade, we're going to have to back that out a couple turns and then crank this up or down. Clockwise is for raising the blade. Counterclockwise is for lowering the blade. Over on the side of the saw is a second knob that looks just like the blade height adjustment knob. This is the blade tilt knob, and likewise it has a locking knob in the middle. This is almost always locked when you're not adjusting the blade, so it should be fully locked when you're done with it. And then you turn it this way and the blade should start to tilt, and you'll notice that the guard tilts with the blade. So they're always in alignment.
We're not going to be using this in our first introductory tasks. This is for more advanced work with the table saw, but you do need to know all of the controls. This guy is called the ripping fence, and this is called the miter gauge. And you will use either one of them or the other one, but never both at the same time. And you have to use one or the other. You can't do freehand stuff. You have to use a fence or a guide or a gauge of some sort. That's a requirement with the table saw. The ripping fence has a lever that locks it. You just push down to lock. You lift up to unlock. And there's no twisting of the knob. You don't need to twist it. If you try to twist it, you're going to unscrew the handle. When you get in a position, you lock it. When you want to move it, you just adjust it. And I recommend that you grab it from right here in the part where it makes a T with itself. And you slide it. The T-track slides in this groove here, and it slides over, and it slides there, left and right. It's best if you grab hold of it right about here, right where the two parts make a T. That's where you have most control over moving it. You don't control it from here, because all that does is tweak the thing left and right. If you need to adjust it here, left and right. We're going to push that out of the way for a second. The miter gauge has this little groove that fits into the slot here. It slides into the T slot. It slides in, and it follows this track and helps guide for cross-cutting type of actions. And you can put it into either of the two tracks. With the saw also, there are some shop-built push sticks. The push sticks are for pushing the wood if your hands get too close to the blade and it's not safe for you to keep your hands that close. So each of these has a little notch, and that fits behind the wood and it keeps your hands well clear of the blade while pushing the wood. Here's the notch on this, and that keeps the hands clear of the blade. Above the table saw, there are guidelines and safety procedures for you to use. There's a main table saw safety guideline procedure. This one applies to all table saws, this table saw or any other table saw. To the right of that is a saw stop table saw. These are some additional specific features for the saw stop. We don't normally get into that into the introduction training, but we do that with more advanced training. And then the saw stop, you see, has various LED light codes saying what is the status of it. And if I had done the full warm-up, it would have a solid green light and a slowly blinking red light while it is initializing. And as you can see from earlier, the solid green light and no red light means the system is ready. No green light and a solid red light means the brake cartridge needs to be replaced. The saw stop has a brake cartridge that prevents this blade from cutting through your fingers should you touch it while it's operating. Inside here, you can kind of see it. It's in the back over there. There's a metal aluminum shroud there, and if your finger touches it, it can sense the electrical current. It jams that aluminum thing into the blade, immediately stopping the blade and preventing your finger from getting cut off. You'll notice that if I touch the blade, the lights here will go from solid green and no red to a solid green and a blinky red. And that was your contact was detected during standby. So you can see it senses your contact. Ensure that all guards are fitted, secured, and properly functional, including the riving knife and the anti-kickback pawls.
Adjust the guard if it hangs up. Do not operate if guards are missing or faulty. The blade has a guard. The guard should be always in place. The missing guard or a damaged guard should be reported immediately. The guard will lift up as the wood goes underneath and will keep you from bringing your fingers in anywhere near the blade while you are using it. The guard can lift up out of the way while you're doing adjustments, while you're adjusting the height of the blade, or while you're lining up your wood to the blade, should you need to do that. On either side of the blade are the anti-kickback pawls. These are designed with little teeth, and the teeth are designed to catch into the wood so that if the saw tries to kick back the lumber at you, it theoretically should catch on these anti-kickback pawls. They should also always be in use. They do have an upper position where you can push them up and lock them into place if they are in the way while you're doing some adjustments. But then when you're done making your adjustments, you need to release them and bring them back down so that they operate. Check your workspaces and walkways to ensure that no slip or trip hazards are present. Pick up cut off scraps. Sweep up sawdust regularly. Keep the table and the work area clear of all tools, off-cut lumber, and sawdust. Always use the dust collection system while operating this saw, even for brief uses and small operations. Best practice is to turn on the dust collector at the start of the workday and leave it on for the entire day while the saw is being in continual or regular use. The dust collector has two ports, one that comes out over here of the arm and comes down and around, and then down behind here, the main dust port out of the back of the machine. And that's where most of the dust is going to get sucked through, and it will go through this first stage collector where some of the large chunks will deposit before going on and carrying the finer dust to the main dust collector. Now the main dust collector has two blast gates. A blast gate for the table saw, and over here, a blast gate for the panel saw. If you are using the table saw, this blast gate needs to be open and the other one needs to be closed. If you're using the panel saw, this one should be closed and that one should be open. And if you're using them both, you can have them both open at the same time. But it's to your advantage to only have the ones open that you are using so that the dust collector is more efficient and collects more of the dust. They are both the same. They just look like this. This one's got a better view. You loosen up the knob, you pull it out. Now it's open. You lock the knob. Loosen the knob, push it closed. Now it's locked. The guard has a built-in dust collector. It sucks in the dust through here, channels it through back here and into the quick release connector here. The hose comes in here and it sucks dirt in and dust through here. This is your first indication that the saw hasn't been being cleaned properly or the dust collector has not been being used, which is quite common, and we need to do better about that. If you start to see dust build up in here, that means that it's not sucking the dust, or too many people have done little one-off cuts and it's built up and it's clogged. So you need to clean that out and get the dust collector working. Adjust the blade height so that the deepest gusset of the blade is just above the thickness of the wood. This allows the sawdust some space to spill out and ensures that the motor does not overwork while cutting the wood. So how do you know how high the blade should be? There's 3 guides that I teach, and we choose the middle one, but I'll teach you the 2 extremes and we'll go with the middle choice. The most extreme, erring on the edge of safety, is to only have 1/4 inch of the blade showing above the wood. And that is considered the safest
use of the table saw. The theory being the more blade that is exposed, the more likely you are to come into contact with the blade. But if you are using a home craftsman or some of the lower end home user models of table saws, you will find that if you are on this very extreme end of safety, your saw is often working harder than it needs to. And if we move the wood to the other side, you notice there's all these gaps and things. And if the gaps are below the wood, it doesn't allow the sawdust to clear out as much. And you'll notice that the place that's actually doing the cut are these three teeth right here. That's what's doing the cut. And when we're down lower, that angle is the smallest angle. The higher we crank up the blade, the more steep that angle becomes, and the less wood that is being cut on each pass. And that makes the saw work less hard and less likely to bind and less likely to throw the wood out at you. Again, if you're using a less powerful saw, a home craftsman or a home DeWalt model, a home user model, you might have to err on a slightly higher side of a blade height than our preferred position. But the compromise then is to take one of these gussets, that's the little valley between the teeth, and whatever the deepest gusset is, that should line up to the top of the wood. And that's our compromise position, and that's the way we practice here at Cal State LA. You could consider this extra deep gusset the deepest gusset, and that would be okay as well. But if these gussets are all allowed to come up and over the wood and clear out, that kind of allows the sawdust to spill over on either side and allows the saw to work a little bit easier. So we're going to go down with this particular blade. There's one option right there, and if we want to be a little bit safer, we're going to go to that as our option. So those are the blade height adjustment guidelines. And you need to adjust the blade height depending on what thickness of material you're working with. This is 3/4 of an inch plywood, so this will work for 3/4 of an inch plywood or 3/4 inch pine. It will not work for 1/2 inch plywood. It will not work for 1/4 inch masonite or 1/4 inch luan. You'll need to adjust the blade to match the material that you're cutting. And it will definitely not work with 2x4. The blade will need to be higher if you're cutting a 2x4. Operational safety checks. These are safety checks you must be aware of at all times while using the tool. And you must check them and perform them every time you use the tool on every single operation or cut. Always use the ripping fence or the miter gauge. The table saw requires a fence or other support for all cuts. The ripping fence and the miter gauge must also never be used together at the same time. Use a push stick for all cuts under 3 inches wide. This keeps your fingers away from the blade. Always allow the blade to come to maximum speed before proceeding with the cut. Never start the saw with the blade touching the material. Always stand to one side of the blade to avoid being caught in the line of kickback. Ensure that no other persons are working behind you while using this tool. When assisting the operator by catching the wood, do not pull the lumber. Simply support the workpiece and let the operator control the work at all times. Before clearing waste and debris or making adjustments, switch the tool off and wait for the machine to come to a complete stop. Use the ripping fence for ripping or cutting with the grain of the lumber. Use the miter gauge for crosscuts or cutting perpendicular to the grain of the lumber. Use the correct blade for the materials being cut, such as using an 80-tooth or greater blade when cutting plexiglass. Now when I'm pushing the wood through, my fence is locked. I know where I want my cut to be. It's important that you keep your hands well clear of the blade while you're making the cut, and it's important that I don't stand right behind the blade. If I stand right behind the blade, then if the wood kicks back, it's going to come back and come straight into me and straight into my gut. And I don't want that to happen. So you want to either stand on one side of the blade or come to the other side and stand over here while you push the wood through. Those are the two safe standing positions. We're going to send the wood through. I've locked my fence. I want this is what I'm concentrating on. This surface, I need to pay attention the whole time with the cut and make sure that my wood stays up against the fence. I don't want it to wander like that or wander like that. I want to do straight cuts and I want to stay, that's my guide. So I need to stay close to that. So I'm going to be pushing with lateral force this way, and I'm going to be pushing forward to push it through the blade. As you are preparing to cut, push with a forward movement from your right hand well to the right of the blade. Using your left hand, apply a lateral force to keep the lumber against the ripping fence. This lateral force needs to stay in front of the blade at all times. Keep your eye on the ripping fence to make sure the lumber stays touching and does not wander. As the lumber progresses forward into the blade, continue forward movement with the right hand. Also continue pushing the lumber with a lateral force with the left hand, but only in front of the blade. Never push with a lateral force on the side of the blade or behind the blade. This will push the lumber into the blade, causing the blade to bind and eventually resulting in kickback, with the tool throwing the lumber back at you. Also continue to ensure that the lumber stays flush to the ripping fence at all times. This is the area in relation to the blade where you must never push laterally. This force will push the lumber into the blade, binding onto the blade and kicking the lumber back at you. When you can no longer push laterally with your left hand, change your left hand force to a forward movement only. Although the blade guard is raised for this picture, you will not be cutting lumber with the guard in this position. The guard was lifted for this photo only. As the lumber goes through the blade, keep the forward movement of the right hand and add the forward movement of the left hand. Continue to keep the lumber flush against the ripping fence at all times. Push the lumber completely past the blade. If possible, push it onto the outfeed table. If you do not push the lumber past the blade, there is still a chance of kickback as you turn off the machine and as the blade spins down. Again, the blade guard was lifted for this photo only. You will not be cutting any lumber with the blade guard lifted. I'm going to put the lumber right behind the blade, but I'm not going to be touching the blade. You never want to start the saws with the lumber touching the blade. We're going to back it up. We're going to bring the guard down, and then we pull the switch. And I'm pushing this way with this hand, but when I get to the blade, I don't want to continue to push that way because that's going to push the cutoff piece into the blade. So mostly I want to keep this hand here, but not keep this pressure going forward. So my hand stays there. This is all staying nice and snug. Now when I get to this point, I'm going to push with this hand forward only, and I'm going to push with this hand forward only. I'm not going to push in with that. And that's our standard ripping cut. The distance here is about a little more than 7 inches. The general rule is if I get under 3 inches, 3 inches or under, I want to use a push stick to help guide the lumber through. So again, I'm pushing force this way and force this way. And then when the wood gets to the table, I can take my push stick notch it behind there. We'll do it with a push stick from another point of view. If this piece is too small, use the push stick to push that out of the way. The ripping fence has a ruler built into it that you can use for your measurements. The ripping fence is only as accurate as this clear gauge is with its fine-tune adjustment. So you can use that as a measuring device, but if you want accurate cuts, I would measure between the fence and the blade only. If we were to set this up to 6 inches, it says it's precisely 6 inches. I'm going to lock it down. I'm going to take a measurement from my blade, and you see it's 6 inches down the center of the blade. I wouldn't want to trust that if I want it to be exactly 6 inches. If I want it to be exactly 6 inches, I will adjust it and I will make it so that my 6-inch mark lines up exactly with this side of the blade. That means the distance between this side of the blade and the fence is 6 inches, and I will cut a 6-inch wide piece of wood. I don't need to mark the piece of wood for 6 inches because I've set my fence up at 6 inches. All I need to do is run the piece of wood and keep it flush up against the fence, and we are good. If I instead needed to cut 6 inches off of a piece of wood, then I want to measure to the other side of the blade because my good piece is over here and I want to cut off 6 inches. So I need to account for the blade width. And sometimes when you lock it down, the fence shifts a little bit. So then you have to unlock it and adjust it again. So the general rule on when it's safe to use the ripping fence versus the miter gauge is how your wood is oriented and how it is in relationship to the fence. The ripping fence is designed for ripping, which is cutting with the grain of wood. And most of our pine has wood that goes in the length of the long strips of wood. Plywood is multiple layers of pine or other material. The grain is alternating. This grain goes this way, the next layer goes this way. The layers are all perpendicular. It gives it the strength. Whereas ripping doesn't apply to plywood because the grain is always going to be ripping one direction and cross-cutting in another. We start to think about the size and shape of the wood. The wood oriented this way is like a ripping action in solid lumber, so I'm going to consider it ripping, and I will use the ripping fence. When I turn the wood 90 degrees, I'm now doing a cross-cutting action similar to what I would be using with the radial arm saw or the miter saw, so I will want to use the miter gauge. The general rule is that if this distance, almost 2 feet, is more than twice this distance, 4.5 inches, then I need to use the miter gauge. If it's under 2 to 1, then I still can use the ripping fence. The reason I can't use the ripping fence for this process to cut this off, if my mark was here, is because it's too easy for this board to shift this way or shift this way. And the minute it shifts like that, it's going to come kicking and flying back up at me. And that is what we don't want to do. That's dangerous. I need to keep it stable and perpendicular to one of these T-slots instead. So what I will do is we will put the miter gauge in the slot. If there's any dust or dirt in the slot, you want to just run it back and forth a few times to clear that out. There's a lot of dust that builds up in there, especially when they aren't in use. We are going to hold the lumber into the fence like that. I can have 3 or 4 hand options here. One is to hold the red handle here and to hold the lumber there, or I can do both hands on the lumber like that. But what I can't do is not hold the lumber. If I don't hold the lumber, then it moves back and forth. The whole point of holding the lumber like this is that I am compressing it and keeping it here so it doesn't shift left and right at all. And I can do that this way as well. And that might be easier for the angle on this cut. So if I'm lining up to a line, which I'm not at the moment, but let's say I would bring that line up, shift my wood left or right, get it exactly where I want, slide it back slightly so it's not touching the blade, close down the guard, turn the saw on, and then push through and push all the way past the blade. We want to push all the way past the blade with it because the saw blade is still spinning down as we're adjusting stuff, and we need to get past this point right here when we push it through. What you don't want to do with the miter gauge is then you don't want to back up, because as I'm backing up, I got caught by the anti-kickback pawls, which they're doing their job. That's a good thing. But it also can cause the wood to shift a little bit or shift into the blade, and then as I'm backing up, it's going to come back and come flying at me. The same thing with this cutoff piece. I don't want to touch that. I don't want to push that through with my hands, because I'm more than likely going to push that into the blade and cause it to come flying up. And I just want to let it go. And then when the saw stops, I can reach in and pull the wood out. With the guard lifted and the saw turned off, line up the lumber with the blade. The example in the photo does not have a pencil mark to line up to, but shows the action of doing so. Back the lumber away from the blade. Make sure your lumber does not shift while moving back. Lower the guard. You may now power up the machine and make your cut. Push the lumber forward with the miter gauge, holding the lumber tight to the miter gauge the entire time. Do not push, touch, guide, or nudge the cutoff piece while the blade is in motion. Let it stay where it stops after the cut has been made. Do pay attention to it just in case the blade kicks it back at you. Do not stop the wood in the middle of the blade. Always push the wood past the blade. If you stop here, the wood has been cut, but the blade is still spinning. This creates a kickback danger. Make sure the miter gauge and the lumber push past the spinning blade. Keep the guard down for the entire cut. Do not back up the lumber while the blade is spinning. Now on this piece, I've marked my wood with a pencil line, so I want to line that up to the blade. I'm going to adjust this, come right up to the blade. I'm going to shift it left and right until the pencil mark is lined up right up with the side of those teeth. And then I'm going to back it up, but I need to hold it in place so that it doesn't shift left and right. Back it up, so now it's not touching the blade. Bring the fence down, the guard down. And again, my second hand hold option here on the red knob and holding this in place. Again, I've got to grip it real tight so it can't wander. And again, I cut past the blade. Always wait for the saw to come to a complete stop before reaching in and grabbing your lumber. And then bring this back. So now we're going to adjust the miter gauge here. You notice the miter gauge has all these different degrees on it. So we can adjust this. If we look on the back side, there's a lever here that pulls out. You can see that. That helps us come back to these preset positions, one for 45, one for 0, and one for the other 45. This doesn't do anything other than pull out. It doesn't twist and turn. It just pulls out like that. This knob loosens up counterclockwise. And if I loosen that up, this push button will cause me to stop at exactly 0 degrees, which I will want to come back to regularly, so that's a good thing to have. If I want to go past that, I need to pull it out, and then I can stop at 15 degrees or wherever I want, whatever angle I need. And then I tighten that down. So now we're going to do the same task, cutting a slight angle or a miter cut. We'll take one of these thinner pieces of wood. Again, the same purpose. If I wanted to cut to this position right there, to that mark, I would line up to that mark. I'd adjust my wood. I'd back up. Bring the guard down. Now when I'm on a slight angle, sometimes the wood will want to push the guard away. So if I want to avoid that, I'll lift up and move myself forward so I'm underneath the guard but not touching the blade, because I never want to be touching the blade when I start. And then I just go forward. And again, I do not reach in and grab that until the saw has come to a complete stop. Now I can get it. And there are my 2 angle cuts, my 2 miter cuts. Voila. Those are the 4 basic cuts that you can do with the ripping fence and the miter gauge. And those will be your practice cuts that you will do in class, in person.
These are potential hazards to be aware of while operating this tool. This saw may kick back lumber at the operator or into the area behind the operator. This is a cutting tool, so it will be expelling flying chips and sawdust. Chips and sawdust can be propelled at high speeds and cause injury to exposed skin. Always wear protective clothing and PPE. When this tool is in operation, the blade is exposed, presenting a potential point of contact for injury. Always be aware of where the blade is and keep yourself and others away from the blade. Eye injuries are possible from flying debris. Cutting finer grained materials such as MDF lumber or masonite can generate very fine particles of dust, creating an additional inhalation hazard. Noise levels can rise above 100 decibels. Protect your ears by wearing hearing protection while using this tool. Do not use faulty equipment. If something is not working properly, or if you suspect something is wrong with the tool or machine, please report this to your instructor and/or to the A&L technical director. Never use the miter gauge and the ripping fence together at the same time with the same cut. Use one or the other, but never both together. Do not freehand cut with the table saw. You must always use either the ripping fence or the miter gauge. Freehand cuts increase the risk of kickback and injury to the operator or to other persons in the shop. Never reach around or over the blade. Do not create special jigs unless they are approved by the technical director. Do not use the table saw or the outfeed table as a workbench. Use a shop table or sawhorses for layout and assembly of your projects. Housekeeping. Turn off the machine and return all guards to fully closed positions. If you have set the blade tilt to an angle and you are finished with your cuts, please return the blade to 0 degrees. Stay with the machine until the blade comes to a complete stop. Remove any cutting stops or jigs. Leave the saw ready for use by the next person. Clean off the tabletop and outfeed table of dust, debris, and scrap lumber. Sweep and vacuum around the base of the machine. Empty the dust collector bag and the first stage collector bin when they are half full. Empty the sawdust into a trash bin with a can liner. Close the liner to contain the dust before taking the dust to the dumpster. Cleanup procedures for the table saw. Sweep and vacuum all of the dust around the base of the saw, making sure you get the nozzle attachments on the shop vac and get in all these cracks and crevices. Pull up the rug, sweep and or vacuum underneath it. Vacuum all of the dust out of these crevices. The saw will operate much better with the dust and debris out of there. On the right side of the saw, you can open this chamber by pushing the red button, and you get access to the inside of the saw, which likes to collect a lot of dust and debris. Vacuum all of this out regularly, ideally daily or at least once a week. On the other side of the saw, there is another chamber. You have to take off the riving knives, and then you can open that chamber. And you can also get at this side to do more vacuuming. Vacuum and dust behind the saw, sweep off and dust off the top of the outfeed table, dust off here, vacuum and dust and sweep around here, vacuum and dust around your dust collector. When the bag gets about half full, the dust collector needs to be emptied. One of the most common tasks you'll be doing with the table saw is taking a full piece of 1x12 or 1x10 or 1x6 and running it through the table saw and ripping it into strips. Now the first thing you want to do is, of course, investigate your lumber and pull out any staples, because if a staple goes through the table saw, it will more than likely set off the saw stop cartridge, because metal is like your flesh. It conducts electricity, and if it comes into contact with the blade, it will set off the safety features, and that will destroy the blade and destroy the cartridge and slow down production. So you want to always be safety conscious and make sure there's no metal screws or nails or anything in the lumber. Just investigating and inspecting all of that. We will be commonly cutting lumber down into 1x3. But 1x3 isn't 3 inches, 1x3 is 2.5 inches wide. So I'm going to adjust my ripping fence to 2.5 inches wide. Just like that. Back it up. There we go, 2.5 inches wide. 1x3 is actually measured to 2.5 inches. Usually lumber is a little bit smaller than its actual width. Or size. 1x is only 3/4 of an inch thick, and 1x10 here is
9 3/8 inches wide. 1x12 is around 11.5. So it's a rough cut to the 1 inch by 12 inches, and then it's sanded smooth, and when they get done sanding it smooth, it's lost anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch. So you got to take that into account. And when I'm cutting this lumber, I'm cutting it by myself in the video, but you will probably often always do a two-person action. You'll have one person controlling the lumber here, and they're pushing it through. That person is called the pusher. And then you'll have another person on the other side of the lumber catching it, and that person is called the catcher. Now the pusher may have the catcher help out with the tail end of the board at start, and then they will run around and catch the outfeed table side. Or you could have 3 people doing that. Or you could set up one of these supports for the wood out here as you line it up. I tend not to do that, it just gets in the way, but it's a very useful tool, so go ahead and do that. Again, it's important that I keep this side of the wood always on the fence. And as I push it through, I'm going to start back here. And when I'm back here, any little adjustment of the wood will cause a lot of adjustment over there. I need it to be straight, I need it to be steady, and I need to not do little tiny adjustments of my body over here. If you want to practice your Tai Chi or your ballroom dance moves, you want to just keep your center of gravity low, and you'll just want to go forward and keep everything low, bending through the knees, and just keep everything steady like that. So I line this up roughly. I turn the saw on. I lift it up. I keep the saw on the table, the wood flat to the table, and I'm watching that guy there. I'm bending with my knees. Get here, I want to push it so it falls off the end of the table. Looking at this operation from the other side of the table, again, if I'm miming the position of the catcher, I'm just supporting the wood as the pusher pushes it towards me. I'm not pulling it along. I'm not shifting it left and right. And I'm definitely doing whatever it takes to help keep the wood flat on the table. Now, sometimes with long pieces of wood, that might require you to lift up higher than the table so that it stays flat on the table. So if you try to keep it level, the weight of the wood may do this, and it may cause the wood to bow up on the table. It's important that the pusher controls everything. They're allowed to keep the wood flush against the ripping fence, and that the wood stays flat on the table. And now, as you'll see, if I was pulling these 2 pieces of wood through, especially the 1x3, I'm just allowing this to come back. The pusher is pushing it, and you'll see that we've set up the table here so that a full 16-foot piece of lumber comes off the table, lands on the floor, and then you can keep cutting piece after piece after piece with no extra trips around to move the wood out of the way.